You're listening to The House of Wolves by Lüthi, performed by Anna Capraro and Scott Miller, produced by Citadel Studios for Sentinel Creatives. The Owl and the Fox. When the girl awoke, she had no name and no memory of ever having had one. She blinked open her eyes, wondering at the strangeness of it, and then realised she couldn't remember anything else either. And it was cold. Very, very cold. She shifted in her cot until she was resting on her elbows and stared around the small, unfamiliar room. The chamber was sparsely furnished, with dark wood panel floors and the walls to match. There must have been a window somewhere above her head, because a thin blade of light illuminated the spot at the foot of her bed. A stone wash basin sat on the floor in the corner, beside the room's solitary exit, a sliding door which opened the moment her eyes came upon it.
"You're up,"
said a shadow, moving into the room.
"It's about time, you know. I'm not sure how much longer I could have waited for you. Not with... well, it doesn't matter. All that matters is that you're up."
The shadow stepped into the pale strip of light, and the girl gasped.
"What's wrong?"
said the creature, for a creature is what it was.
"Haven't you ever seen a guide before?" I suppose you wouldn't have, would you? Not from where you're from, anyway."
"What are you?" She knitted her brow as it scuffled forward, only to drop a bundle on the bed beside her and move back into the light. The creature stood on two legs, unremarkable in itself, but the legs were shorn like that of a horse or deer. Yellow fur covered its body, ending in a blotch of inky blackness at the tip of its tail, which fidgeted in the air behind it, seeming to move of its own accord. The creature's face made her think of a cross between a monkey and some kind of dog, with long sharp teeth and a protruding snout. Piercing amber eyes met her gaze when she looked past its nose, and she turned away before she could blink.
"Put that on,"
said the creature, waving a hand at the bundle. It rolled its black tongue behind its teeth, warbling like a summer bird, and winked an amber eye at her.
"We aren't all gifted with such a mighty pelt as mine, but your shivers are making even me feel cold. As for what I am, I already told you. I'm a guide, but you can call me Pakta."
"Pakta? Okay, Pakta. Where are we?" The girl glanced at the bundle by her legs and saw that it was a thick cotton robe. It looked snug, so she pulled it over her head while she listened to Pakta's answer.
"If it pleases you, we are in the 13th room, on the 5th floor, in the eastern block of the House of Okami."
The girl frowned. Okami's house? I've never heard of it. But would I even know if I had? How did I get here, Pakta? And why can't I remember anything?
That I cannot tell you."
He suddenly looked uncomfortable, warbling and clicking softly beneath his breath, while his tail swished in the air behind him.
"But you're here, which means you are a guest of the Okami, and I am your guide."
The girl nodded to herself, still not sure she could trust her own eyes and ears. Here was a monkey dog thing, telling her she was a guest in a house she'd never heard of, and that this Pakta was to be her guide. She was tempted to pinch herself. But if it were only a dream, she thought she might like to know how it ended. "Okay, Pakta. Can you at least tell me where you will be guiding me to?" Pakta smiled, revealing a set of razor-sharp teeth, his tongue clicking against his palate behind them.
"Not to, but through. I will be your guide through the House of Okami. But come, it is time we leave this room behind. There are many other rooms waiting for us."
"Fine," said the girl, getting to her feet. She noticed a pair of flat wooden sandals beside her bed that looked about her size and slipped them on. Now that she was standing, Pakta looked smaller than she'd first realised. The creature only reached about as high as her waist, but his tail was long enough to wind itself comfortably around them both. It curled behind his shoulder, gently twitching like a snake tasting the air, and then wrapped itself around his midriff like a belt. The girl had to quash the sudden urge to run a hand through the fluffy yellow fur on the top of Pakta's head, only managing to restrain herself at the thought of his sharp little teeth biting into her wrist, and nodded when he motioned toward the door. The small creature chirped happily beneath his breath when he saw her following behind him, then pushed the door open with a flick of his tail and grinned at her.
Welcome to Akami's house.
Her room, it turned out, was just one of many. The same black-framed doors covered both sides of a seemingly endless corridor, and the girl wouldn't have been able to guess which one was hers, even if she tried. Pakta seemed to know where they were going, though. At least, she hoped so. The impish little creature skipped ahead of her, babbling on in a continuous stream of chirps, warbles, and questions he never waited to hear the answers to.
Keep up,
he said, his tail shivering impatiently. The tail, she'd noticed, was near as long as she were tall, and was crowned by a single tuft of grey that nestled amongst the otherwise dark hairs at its tip. Maybe it was just her imagination, but it looked a little like an eye to her, and she felt it watching her as she hurried her pace.
Nobody ever listens to Pakta,
he was saying when she caught up.
Pakta says we need more light in here. Everybody smiles and nods, but then what? Nothing. Then when something goes wrong, they'll say, but Pakta, why are there so few lights? Then it's Pakta's fault.
The girl nodded, though she wasn't really sure she understood. If he'd asked her, she would have told him she thought there was plenty of light in the corridor, even if she had yet to identify its source. There are more of you, she asked, slipping the question into a rare gap between his monologues.
Of course! You think they'd leave me to do this on my own? No, not me. Not Pakta. I am your guide, yes, but there are many others.
Which means that there are more like me. Pakta nodded sagely.
Oh yes, many more.
The girl paused in her steps to stare at the nearest door. It was indistinguishable from the ones before it, with a black wooden frame and small semi-translucent white panes. Are they here? In these rooms? I'd like to see another person, if I may. Her guide shook his head and waved a hand at her to follow. When he saw that she would not, he shuffled toward her and let out a sigh.
These rooms are not for you, and this is not the time for their occupants. When they are ready, they will awake and have their own guides. But for now, they must wait, and we must go.
Where are we going, Pakta?
It's not far now. Please, you must follow me.
The guide's tail uncoiled itself from around his waist and tugged at her arm gently, like a hand. She hesitated, but then accepted the proffered limb and followed after him. Together they ventured further into the house of Akami. Sometimes they talked, though Pakta wouldn't reveal anything more about the inhabitants of the other rooms. And sometimes they journeyed in silence, slowly growing more at ease in each other's company. They walked like this until the corridor grew narrower and the space between each door grew wider. They walked until the girl's legs grew sore and her brow sheened with sweat. They walked until, finally, when there were no more doors, the passage came to an abrupt end. "What now?" asked the girl. She stared up at the empty wall and dabbed at her forehead with the sleeve of her robe. "Have you led us to a dead end, Pakta?" The yellow-furred creature ignored her, instead stepping forward to examine the white panels in front of them. He stared at them carefully, and then clasped his hands together excitedly and chirped something beneath his breath. "What are you doing?" The girl frowned as she watched her guide jump from foot to foot, waving his hands at the wall in a series of complicated gestures. Pakta grunted, his tail flashing out above his head, weaving a pattern of its own. It was, she decided, the strangest thing she could ever imagine. But before she could laugh at his curious dance, the wall began to change. She almost didn't notice it at first, but when the panels to her left started to shift, she let out a startled breath. The panels moved slowly and then with more speed, falling in on themselves while she watched. Pakta seemed to be controlling the pieces with his hands, and she could hear him chirping softly beneath his breath as he directed their movement. "Magic," she breathed, watching as the wall tumbled away and then reformed again a few seconds later. Only, this time, there was a small wooden door where there had been nothing before.
You see?
Said Pakta proudly. He grinned up at her, his arms still splayed out in front of him.
I told you it wasn't far to go. Didn't I say?
"This door is different," said the girl, slowly approaching it.
Oh yes, very different.
Pakta lowered his hands and sidled up beside her. There was a hint of reverence in his voice when he said,
This door is important. It is not like the others.
"What's so special about it?" Pakta's tail curled around the door's shiny bronze doorknob and slowly squeezed it open.
Why don't you see and find out?
The girl stared into the room, seeing only a stone floor and shadowy corners. She glanced at Pakta, who bobbed his head reassuringly, his tail mimicking the action beside his head. "Okay," said the girl, stepping over the threshold.
I'll be waiting for you when you're done.
The door began to creak closed behind her, and she felt panic rise in her chest. "You're not coming with me?"
Oh no,
said Pakta, with a quick shake of his head.
this room isn't for me. You must do this by yourself.
"Do what?" asked the girl, but the door was already squeezing shut, and she could hardly hear his reply.
You'll figure it out.
Came Pakta's muffled voice, and then the door clicked against the wall, and she was alone. "Deep breaths," said the girl to herself, as her heart thumped against her chest. She filled her lungs with air and slowly exhaled as she looked around the room. It was bigger than it appeared from outside, filling a space at least as wide again as the passage she'd come from. The floor was made of a dark red stone built in concentric circles around a table in the centre of the room. Someone had placed a pillow in front of the table, and she saw a small silver box resting upon it. Seeing nothing else in the room, she waited for her heart to slow its frantic rhythm, and then made her approach. The box was light in her hands, and she made sure to place it down gently on the table before resting her knees on the pillow and taking a proper look at it. It was a jewellery box, she realised, and something stirred in the back of her mind. Had she seen it before? Did it belong to her? Figures had been carved onto the lip of the box, and she turned it over in her hands to stare at their dancing forms. A man and a woman, dressed in lavish robes, danced beneath a blossom tree. A fox pranced beside them, and an owl watched them from the branches above. The girl gazed at it for a moment, and then tilted the box over. She ran a finger over the delicately carved edges, looking for a clasp or opening, and finding neither. She was about to give up when she felt something move beneath her thumb. A silver dial, almost too thin to notice, had been carved into the owl's chest. When she looked again, she saw another beneath the fox's paw, and two more hidden among the folds of the dancer's robes. She rolled her thumb over the owl's dial with an easy familiarity that told her that the box was hers, or at least it had been. And then she gently moved the other dials until she'd settled on a set of symbols that spelt out another thing she knew to be her own. "Leah," she said softly. The name felt right on her lips, and a smile broke out on her face as relief flooded through her. She had a name now. Everything else would follow, she was sure of it. She let out a sharp breath as the little box suddenly began to whir in her hands, humming softly as the spring mechanism inside started to turn. Leah blinked, and the box clicked open. The first notes of a tune rung out as the lid slid back, pushing the dancing figures momentarily out of sight. She thought she might recognize the song, and a memory began to stir in her mind. She remembered a garden and a blossom tree and the first bloom of spring beneath it. But was that her life, or was she remembering a dream? She couldn't quite tell, and she wasn't yet convinced that this wasn't all still a dream either. The last notes of the song faded as Leah stared down into the padded interior of her jewelry box. It was empty, aside from a simple ivory brooch that lay nestled between one of the sleeves. She tugged it out and let it fall into her palm. Kubasa, she said, frowning at the word that had spilled unbidden from her mouth. The brooch was about as wide as her thumb, with a simple bronze pin at its back. No great craft had gone into its making, not like the jewelry box, but the lupine snout and deep-set eyes were unmistakable. Kubasa, she said again, naming the Wolf Lord. She remembered him now, and now that she had remembered him, it was like she'd never forgotten him at all. Kubasa the wise, the thinker, and patron god of scholars everywhere. She fixed the brooch to her robe and placed the jewelry box back where she'd found it before getting back up from her knees. She'd come back for it once she'd figured out what she was doing here, and just who or what this Okami was. Before she could turn back the way she'd come, the walls of the room shuddered, like the first breath on a winter's morn. Leah nearly fell back to her knees when the floor beneath her started to shake, but she gripped onto the table for support until the tremble passed. When she looked up, it was just in time to see the walls around her ripple as they reformed. The panels were swept aside, bouncing and settling into new places at the whims of some unseen force, and soon another door was revealed. This time, on the opposite side of the room. Leah took one last look at the silver jewelry box on the table, and then walked out of the room. She had what she wanted. She had her name. The Wind Sorrows.
And?
Said Pakta when she emerged from the room.
Did you find what you were looking for?
How did you get in front of... Leah frowned and then shook her head. You know what? Never mind. And yes, I think so anyway. I know who I am now. Well, I know my name, and that's a start. Her guide shifted off of his cervine haunches, using his tail as a spring to get back to his feet, and waddled over to her. It was only then that she noticed the change around them. The corridor was gone, its black-framed doors and other rooms along with it. In its place, a bamboo walkway stretched out as far as the eye could see. Ladders hung over its side, spindly pieces of wood held together by bits of string and faith alone. When she peered over the edge of the walkway, she saw a swirling pool of mist and the faint outlines of another bridge below. She drew her head back before she could become dizzy, and stared quizzically at her guide.
What?
He asked, meeting her stare. What happened to the other rooms?
They're behind us now. But don't worry, Pakta will make sure you don't fall off Bamboo Way.
I can't see the ceiling. Pakta's round eyes narrowed, and he stared up at where the roof should be. After a moment, he shrugged and looked back at her.
That doesn't mean it isn't there.
I suppose not. She placed her palm on the frail-looking handrail and stared along the winding bridge. Fist-sized orange lanterns hung from posts every few yards or so, and the fog steeped around the edges of their light.
Come,
said Pakta. She felt his tail loop around her free hand and tug at her meaningfully.
This is not a place for resting. We must go quickly, And be careful not to disturb the other inhabitants of the bridge.
Leah raised a brow and snuck another glimpse back over the side. The mist hung heavy in the air, as dead and still as the ocean after a storm. The light of the lanterns was barely strong enough to penetrate their surroundings, and she could make out little beyond the warm glow of the bridge. She was about to look away again, when she thought she saw a movement. Something within the fog shifted, a shadow of a shadow, a great appendage, or a fin, or a tail. She couldn't tell, but when she blinked, the shadow was gone, and the fog was as dead and still as it had ever been.
Come on,
said Pakta from beside her. He pulled at her again, more forcefully this time, before she finally let go of the handrail and followed after.
That's a good name,
said Pakta when she told it to him. He warbled beneath his breath and nodded.
Yes, I like it. Leah.
Pakta said as much with clicks and chirps as he did with words, and she was starting to understand what a few of them meant. This one, a short roll of the tongue behind his teeth, meant approval, and she smiled to herself as they continued down the bamboo walkway. The bridge was not the only structure in this place, nor the only walkway. Other bridges had crisscrossed above and beneath them while they walked. Bamboo towers had emerged beside them in the mist, floating past them like ships at sea. Huge corded nets hung over the walkway in places, though Pakta wouldn't say what they were for. One of them had been cut to shreds and lay in a tattered ruin upon the deck. Leah thought she'd spotted another guide on one of the floating towers, but the flash of yellow fur had disappeared behind a bamboo wall before she could be sure. Another time, she thought she'd heard singing in the distance, a gentle melody, beautiful to the ears, but it never got any closer, and eventually it disappeared into the fog too. When the bridge started to become narrower, they were forced to walk in single file. Leah used the handrails like the paddles of a ski, keeping close behind Pakta and her eyes on the floor beneath her. She felt exposed with the fog swirling around her ankles, and hardly a yard between her and the edge of the bridge and the void beyond.
We're nearly there,
said Pakta softly. He came to a stop and held a finger up to his mouth, motioning at her to keep quiet.
Sometimes he waits until the very end to make an appearance.
Who is he? Leah brushed away Pakta's tail when he tried to cover her mouth with it, and glared at him.
You must keep quiet,
he said, with an apologetic shrug.
He can't hear me, but he'll come if he knows you're here.
Leah frowned. That didn't make any sense. But she kept her questions to herself and followed Pakta obediently when he waved her forward. When the walkway started to broaden out again, she thought she could just make out the edges of the room spreading in the distance before them. As they got closer, she could see its walls, once white, had been charred grey by fire and dust. Debris covered the floor at the base, and great gaping holes covered it in various places. Pakta looked around nervously, hesitating over the last few steps between the bridge and a small, sturdy-looking door on the other side.
I think,
he began, before he let out a cry of alarm and dragged Leah down against the handrail beside him. For her part, Leah managed to muffle her surprised yell and cushioned her fall against Pakta's fluffy hind legs. The guide let out a groan, but didn't shove her off, instead moving closer against the handrails to make space.
Look,
he whispered, pointing upwards with his tail.
He comes. The Voyager.
Leah squinted into the darkness. At first, she saw nothing, just a thick cover of fog that hung over the walkway. But then, she tilted her head, focusing on a sound so faint she thought it was her own heart beating in her chest. The mist swirled for a moment, the soft leathery thump growing louder by the second. And then, with an echoing rumble like that of a bullhorn, the Voyager broke through the fog. Leah gasped in amazement, and then nearly choked when Pakta leapt to cover her mouth with his hands.
You must keep quiet,
he repeated, clasping her lips shut tight. He stared into her face with a panicked intensity and only relinquished his grip when she managed a weak nod. After another moment, he rolled off her, but she noticed his tail hovering nearby, just in case. Another bullish rumble forced her eyes back up in time to watch the Voyager pass over their spot on the bridge. The creature was nearly translucent, its grey skin looking more like wax than flesh. Thin veins pulsed within its belly, glowing brightly as the light of the nearest lantern illuminated them. The beast was near as wide as she was tall, but long enough that it could have swallowed half a dozen of her without pause. Barnacle-like shells clung to its belly, and she thought she saw a row of feelers, or maybe they were tentacles, extending out from its chest. A massive dorsal fin shuddered on its back, shifting as the creature subtly adjusted its path.
"He's looking for you,"
said Pakta, following its route with his eyes. Why, she wanted to ask. What had she done to deserve such a thing? But she kept her mouth shut, not wanting to attract the Voyager's attention or to have Pakta's grubby little hands near her face again. The Voyager let out another deep rumble, its feelers extending out before it like a blind man's arms, and then it was gone, submerging itself into the thick fog on the other side of the bridge.
Come,
Pakta urged, pulling her to her feet.
before he comes back."
Leah winced as another rumble echoed from within the swirling vapour, but let Pakta drag her across the bridge without a backward glance. Her heart was still pounding in her chest by the time they reached the other side, and it was with no small sense of relief that she pushed open the door to the second room. A small fire crackled in the hearth beside the door, but if there was any warmth coming from it, she couldn't tell. The floor beneath her feet was covered in a mauve carpet, a zigzag pattern repeating itself from one corner of the room to the other, and in the centre of the room sat a small chair beside an instrument she knew to be a banhu. How she knew this, she wasn't sure, but she guessed she must have been familiar with it before she'd lost her memories, before she'd woken up in Okami's house. She circled the instrument, content to catch glimpses of it out of the corner of her eye as she examined the rest of the room. She felt silly about it, but she didn't want to act too direct in case she spooked the memory and sent it back into hiding. But when she decided that there was nothing else to see, she gently slipped into the chair and cradled the banhu's frame in her hands. Like the jewellery box, it was familiar to the touch, and she felt her fingers twitch as they remembered long-forgotten patterns. But something was missing. She glanced around the floor beside her seat until her eyes settled on the banhu's bow. It fit into her hand like it was made for it, and she let out a satisfied grunt before she began to play. The first note wavered, and for a split second she thought she had been mistaken, that this hadn't been her instrument, that she couldn't play. But then it all came rushing back to her, and her fingers swept across the banhu's neck, pounding out notes with the dexterity of a master. She closed her eyes, forcing back the tears she felt welling in them, and concentrated on the music. She remembered other things now too. A boy, her brother. He had been small, younger than her by a good few years. And her father, a giant of a man who had doted on her like she was the centre of his universe. Then she remembered her mother. Strong and bold, she had been the one to teach her how to play. When she opened her eyes, she could hear their voices again, like they were in the room with her. And then she heard another instrument join her own. Only, the music wasn't in her mind. She could hear it playing beside her. Magic, she whispered, knowing that it was true, and knowing then, without a shadow of a doubt, that it was her mother who had joined her in duet. They finished the song together, racing to the end in a soaring harmony. Leah let the last note ring out, holding on to it even as her mother's instrument began to fade. When she was done, She lowered her bow and smiled. It was only then that she noticed the markings on the butt of her bow. It was barely 3 grooves cut into the wood, but she recognized the image. It was on Yarrow, the singer. "These rooms," said Leah, walking beside Pakta. "They belong to the gods, don't they?" Pakta clapped his hands together and nodded.
Yes, yes. This is their house.
"But you told me this was Okami's house." Pakta tapped his wolfish snout and showed his teeth.
They are one and the same. The Wolf Lords, Okami, the Wind Sorrows. Different names in different places, but they are all each other.
Leah didn't reply at first, content to walk beside her guide along the woodland path for a spell. The last room had opened up into a forest. Ancient trees covered both sides of the walkway, climbing up into the sky and forming a canopy overhead. Vines and shoots covered every speck of free space, and Leah was quite certain she'd never seen anything so green in all her life. "Why are they testing me?" she asked, after giving it some thought. "These rooms, they are tests, are they not?" Pakta warbled in what Leah had come to recognize as a nervous tone and shook his head.
Not for me to say, no. Pakta is a guide, but the rooms are not for him.
"But you know what they are for." Leah tried to grab onto her guide's shoulder, but he was too nimble and skipped out of the way before she could reach him. He hovered a little way ahead and then used his tail to hook onto the nearest tree and pulled himself up into its branches.
Pakta is a guide!
His voice was muted by the thicket of leaves, but he stuck his head out and stared down at her nervously.
I can only show you where the doors are. The rest you must learn yourself. Pakta knows it's hard, but that is the way it is supposed to be.
Leah sighed her annoyance. "How many times have you done this? How many times have you led people through this place?" Pakta let out another shrill chirp and hid his face behind the leaves. "Pakta!" She crossed her arms and glared into the branches. "How many times?"
You were my first.
He said, sticking his golden snout out from between the leaves.
Pakta hasn't done this before either.
"Great," said Leah, rolling her eyes. "Do you even know where we're going?" Her guide dropped back down to the forest floor, an indignant look on his face.
You think we would have made it this far if I didn't? Or got past the Voyager? We are going through the House of Okami. I know the way.
"If you say so." Leah snorted at the look on Pakta's face. Okay. You know the way. I believe you."
Good. Now come. We have more doors to find before we can rest. Then you must make homage to Saima, the Lord of Dreams.
"The Lord of Dreams," said Leah softly, almost to herself. "And he will tell me..." But Pakta was already moving, bounding ahead with his tail whipping out behind him. He disappeared behind a clump of foliage, only to reappear further down the path, beckoning her forward. After a moment, Leah followed. The third room had been smaller than the previous ones, with thatch walls and a moss carpet. There had been a pale light shining in from a skylight above, while tallow candles had covered its floor. Pools of wax welled beneath them, but the candles never seemed to diminish or fade. And then, in the centre of the room, beside a water jar of incense and a bundle of silk, she had found a loom. Her loom. "So, I'm a weaver?" she asked Pakta when she emerged from the room.
No, not a weaver,
said her guide, leading her through another winding corridor.
though that is among your skills.
Leah nodded, though she wasn't sure what to make of that. She was getting tired of the riddles and questions and half-answers. The more she remembered, the more she knew she didn't know. She would have to confront Pakta about it again soon enough, but this time without letting him scurry off into the safety of a tall tree. The corridor split into 3 smaller passages, and then 3 again. Each time, Pakta took them down the middle, though, on the 3rd such occasion, Leah thought he hesitated. She didn't press the issue, not wanting to agitate her little guide further. When they'd walked a little while, another door appeared in the wall. There was something old about it, and something, she thought, that hinted of decay. When they got closer, she tilted her head. There was someone inside. She could hear them sobbing. She turned to Pakta, but her guide shook his head.
This door is not for you.
Can't we help them? He shook his head firmly. If you just let me speak to whoever is in there, maybe I...
You cannot help,
said Pakta. He looked a little pale, if that were even possible beneath the yellow fur.
What is inside cannot be helped.
What do you mean, cannot be helped? Leah's brow furrowed into a V, and she looked past Pakta at the door. There was no doorknob or handle, she noticed, but a small grille had been wedged into the wood at about eye level. A symbol had been carved above the door, though she didn't recognize it. It reminded her a little of a sundial or some kind of timepiece.
Like the Voyager, not everything in this place means you well.
Pakta tugged at her arm, and she let him guide her past the door. The sobbing grew louder as they neared it, and Leah felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end.
Nothing good in there. No, not for you, Leah.
The sobbing eventually faded as they left the door behind them, but Pakta kept his tail looped firmly around Leah's arm. Maybe it was to reassure her, or maybe it was to reassure himself. She wasn't sure. When Leah's legs grew tired, and the weight of all that she had seen and felt and heard started to weigh her down, she found a crook in the wall between 2 new corridors and rested down against it. Pakta tried his best to keep her going, but she was having none of it, and eventually he nestled down beside her, and they both fell into a deep sleep. In her dreams, the girl met with Saimar, but the Wolf Lord was on fire, and her sleep was restless. Broken things. Leah flinched in her sleep as a sound from the waking world penetrated her dreams. It was a distant rumble at first, and then it became a roar, merging with her thoughts. The noise appeared as a thunderous black wave that swept across her dreams, dousing the embers of what had come before until there was nothing left. Somebody was calling her name, shouting it from a great distance. She tried to ignore it, but the cry grew louder until it threatened to drown out everything else. When she couldn't handle it anymore, she broke from her dream and snapped open her eyes.
Leah!
Pakta was standing over her, shaking her by the shoulder with both hands.
We have to go! Come on, get up!
What's going on? She blinked away her sleep, trying to forget the burning figure of Saimar from her dreams and the black tide that had washed him away.
No time for that.
Pakta shook his head, still pulling at her shoulder.
We have to go.
Okay. I'm getting up. Leah swatted away his hands and then rose from the crook in the wall she'd been leaning against. Her neck felt a little stiff from the angle, but her legs didn't hurt so much anymore. She could still smell Saimar's smouldering white pelt from her dreams. It was making her eyes water. She frowned at that and turned to stare back down the way they'd come. Black smoke was spilling across the floor, coiling across the panelled tiles and walls like a lava flow. It was still some way away, but the dense wall of smoke was edging closer by the minute. Pakta? Her guide looked close to panic, and his amber eyes were wide when he stared up at her.
I told you, we have to go, before it's too late.
Leah flinched as a sharp crack echoed from behind the smoke. It was followed by a deep rumble, and then what sounded like a stone being ground down and broken into pieces. Another sharp crack reverberated through the passage, and Leah thought she saw the walls behind the smoke tumbling to the floor, and a dark shape moving through the wreckage. She gasped when she realized what she was seeing. Something was tearing the house of Akami apart. Pakta was dragging her away from the destruction before she had time to see what it was, but she felt more than saw the impression of an octopoidal figure, of oily tendrils and black-crusted gills. The sight turned her heart cold in her chest, and she pumped her legs harder to keep up.
This way,
shouted Pakta, steering her toward a fork in the corridor. 4 more passages appeared after that, and he used his tail to nudge her toward the second on the left. They scrambled past another set of doors, and then up a short flight of stairs before the corridor came to an abrupt end, and they stumbled out into a wide atrium. Leah slowed in her steps, her eyes growing wide as she took in the contents of the hall. A golden haze of light hung in its center, above a shallow pool of velvet water. The shining orb was spinning slowly, its radiance illuminating the dozens of doors that lined each side of the room. And above them, carved into the walls in stunning marble, were the Wolf Lords. There was Kabasa, the thinker, and beside him, Dulfwan, the builder, and Onyaro, the singer. Their eyes shone like emeralds, pulsing with a light of knowledge. She searched the walls for Saimar, but couldn't find the dreamer among their number. A pang of despair wrenched at her gut as she remembered her vision, his snow-white pelt burning into dust, only to be swept away by the tide.
This way!
Pakta skipped ahead of her, glancing over his shoulder to urge her forward. She saw a flash of fear in his eyes and looked back down the stairs. Black smoke was pouring across the tiles, hurtling through the passageway like an avalanche. It had started to swirl, turning into an all-consuming vortex, and she heard another groan in the distance as more of the house collapsed. This time, she didn't need Pakta to drag her away from the smoke, and was sprinting along beside him before he could pull at her sleeve. She resisted the urge to look back, even when it sounded like the walls were collapsing in their wake. She knew it would cost her precious moments, and she wasn't sure she wanted to see that dark presence she'd felt beneath the smoke anyway. When they reached the pool, Leah spotted other guides racing through the atrium, little flashes of yellow and purple and silver and blue disappearing up ladders or through the doors ahead. One of them simply clicked his fingers and disappeared into thin air. Where did he go? Pakta ushered her up another pair of steps and chirped anxiously.
To another place I cannot take you. Come, we must go through here.
Her guide bounded ahead of her, springing open the second door in a row of doors that lined the end of the atrium. But before Leah could follow him through, a thick swirling wall of smoke swept out in front of her, blocking her path. The tendril shuddered, and she thought it was about to blow over her, but it just hovered there, all oily tendrils and quivering darkness. Pakta was shouting something from within the room behind it, but his words were muffled and she couldn't make sense of them. Leah hesitated, but seeing no other choice, she barged open the next door. It was only when she was shouldering her way through that she heard the grief-stricken sobbing and recognized the sigil carved into the wood. This room was not for her. The door slammed shut behind her, and she quickly scanned the room in search of its occupant. But it was empty. She frowned, realizing the crying she'd heard from outside was gone too. "Pakta!" she called, trying the door. She rattled the frame a few times, but it wouldn't budge, not even when she threw her shoulder at it. After another half-hearted attempt, she gave up and took another look at the room. Like the others, it was different, unique in its own way. The stony, smooth surface beneath her feet was hard and grey and covered every spare inch of the floor and walls. It reminded her a little of a cave or cell. She walked to the other end of the room, her sandals clicking against the stone, and waved her hands at the wall like she'd seen Pakta do. But no magic responded to her frantic gesturing, and no new door appeared against the rock. She scowled to herself and turned back to try the door again, only to freeze in her steps. A table had appeared in the centre of the room. It stood no higher than her knees, with a grey cushion sat in front of it, much like in the first room she'd entered. This time, however, there was no jewellery case waiting for her to unlock. Instead, a knife. The tantor was only slightly larger than her hand, with a blade that looked sharp enough to slice through even stone. Its sheath rested beside it, a jewel-encrusted piece of hardened leather, with tassels to fasten it to its bearer's belt. Leah knelt down beside the table and scrutinised the blade. No memories flashed before her, and no answers appeared in her mind's eye. She lifted it gently from the pillow and held it up cautiously before her. A symbol had been etched into the blade, though she couldn't quite make it out. It looked a little like the tentacles of an octopod, with sharp beady eyes that stared back up at her. The blade fell from her hands as a memory came racing back to engulf her senses. She was standing beneath the blossom tree outside her home. Black smoke was spreading over the mountains, and violent voices were following it. Anger and hate boiled around her, a storm of darkness that consumed. Men cried out in the dark, women too. And then she felt it. Excruciating pain coursed through her body, and she found herself on her knees, grasping at her side. The tantor was there, sticking out from between her ribs. When she looked up, the blossom tree was on fire, and the world along with it. When Leah emerged from the room, Pakta was waiting for her on the other side. He looked worried half to bits, and his tail was frayed where he'd been chewing at it. The little guy took one look at her pale face and let out a miserable sigh.
No. You weren't supposed to find out. Not like that.
Leah wiped at her nose and stifled a sob. How could you not tell me?
It wasn't my place. Not my place.
Pakta shook his head, his own sad eyes mirroring hers.
I'm just a guide, and that room wasn't meant for you. You weren't supposed to know that you're...
Dead. You can say the word, you know. Leah straightened her back and cleared her throat, wiping away the wetness on her cheeks. Fine. Now I know. But why am I here? And what is that thing tearing everything apart? The truth, Pakta. Pakta wrung his tail between his hands and bounced from foot to foot before Leah glared at him, and he decided it was better to come clean.
This is a place of waiting,
he said, picking his words.
Yes, of waiting.
For what? Pakta looked uncomfortable and glanced over her shoulder, ignoring her gaze.
We really should get going before...
I'm not going anywhere until you answer my questions. Pakta chirped nervously, and then gave up resisting.
The House of Akami is where they decide what is to become of your soul. This is where they determine your fate.
They, the Wolf Lords. Pakta nodded. Hence the tests. This is where I am to be judged. Pakta nodded again. Okay, said Leah, taking a breath. And what was that thing behind us? Why is everything falling apart?
That is not supposed to be here.
Pakta wrinkled his snout.
It is from another place. One that means all harm. You have seen it before, I think.
I have. Leah frowned, trying to remember.
It was there the day you died.
I remember. And she did. The black pall of smoke had swept through her town, making everyone go mad. Men had drawn their swords in fear, and then against one another as a blind fury overcame them. Blood had followed.
It is chaos.
Pakta chirped softly.
Destruction, broken things, annihilation. Your world is coming undone, and with it, so is ours.
She blinked away the memory of her home and of her final moments. But why does it destroy?
Why does the wind blow? Why does the sea rise? Or the rain fall? It is the way of the thing. It cannot help itself.
A roar of breaking mortar echoed behind them, and Pakta snapped his eyes to stare at the corridor.
It won't be long now before all of this is gone.
And then what? Pakta shrugged.
And then it'll be gone.
Leah stared down at her feet, and then at her guide. What becomes of me, then? If I haven't finished my test?
Ah.
Pakta licked at his lips, his tail wriggling in his hands.
I don't know. I've never... You'll have to wait, I think. Until the wind sorrows return.
And when will that be?
It is hard to say. Time is different here. It could be days that feel like hours, or weeks that feel like years. But when the darkness goes, they will come back. They always do. Until then, you must leave the house of Okami behind, or be swallowed by the chaos.
Another sound, like splintering wood and cracking tiles, rang through the passageway. It was getting closer. Pakta looked up at her pleadingly until, finally, Leah relented. Let's go. Together, they raced away from the black smoke and crumbling house, away from the darkness and broken things. They moved quickly, managing to keep just ahead of the groaning walls and slumping house. Behind them, strange noises had joined the chorus of destruction. Inhuman hoots and grunts, a great slopping sound, like some great tentacled beast emerging from a pool of water. And then, more distantly, the slow beat of leathery wings. Pakta led her across another atrium and through a tunnel filled with floating lights and bubbling fountains. They passed tributes to the wolf lords, golden statues and diamond mosaics, but of the gods themselves there was no sign. The other guides they encountered didn't stick around long either, snapping their fingers together the moment they saw the churning cloud of smoke approaching. Most of them disappeared immediately after that, while others urged them onward, waving them away from the chaos as they slowly faded into nothingness. Eventually, when Leah's lungs felt fit to burst and her legs ready to fall out under her, Pakta slowed to a halt. They'd managed to put some distance between themselves and the blossoming smoke, but she could still hear the building crumbling apart. Something large was bellowing in the distance. It made her skin crawl.
This is it,
said Pakta, opening his arms wide and turning to her.
The last door to the house of Okami.
It was a modest thing, Leah thought. Iron grey hinges and a wooden frame with a simple brass handle. But it was very tall, and she strained her neck looking for the top. A giant could have walked through it. Or a god. Pakta rubbed his hands together and approached the door. He was chirping something softly beneath his breath, his tail coiling around his neck and shoulders. The guide repeated the series of gestures she'd seen him use to transform the wall, and then began his strange little dance. After a moment, the door started to hum. Then the wooden frame shuddered, and golden light pierced the gaps between its wall and hinges. More light blazed through it, responding to Pakta's summons, until Leah could hardly stare at it without blinking.
Come! We must leave this place behind!
Leah watched him walk toward it, until his silhouette was absorbed by the blindingly brilliant light. And then he was gone.
Come on!
Taking a deep breath, Leah did what she'd done since she'd woken up in the house of Okami. She followed. Her skin grew warm as she crossed beneath the blinding arch, and she closed her eyes. But not even that was enough to keep the scorching glow away. Then, after a cautious step, and then another, the light began to fade away until she was able to open her eyes. She found herself standing at the top of a flight of steps. All around her, as far as she could see, was an empty white plain. When she looked back, the doorway was gone. Grey stone covered the surface of the wall she'd passed through, and it didn't look like it was likely to open again, not without Pakta's magic. The sounds of breaking, of chaos and destruction were muted from outside, though she could still hear the distant thunder of whatever creature was tearing through the house. But still, she was no longer scared of it. That sound was no longer for her. It would not cross beyond the house of Okami. Little Pakta stood waiting for her at the bottom of the steps, and a smile spread across his face when he saw her coming down to join him. His tail whipped out to greet her, wrapping itself around her arm in a warm hug. "What now?" she asked, looking to her friend as she stroked the tail absently. She sat down on the step, dropping her slippers onto the smooth white sand and staring across the plain. The brightness that had greeted her was already starting to dim, and she could see tendrils of darkness growing on the edges.
Now you wait.
Wait for what?
For the light to come back.
Leah nodded and then crinkled her brow. "Aren't you going to go with the others?" Pakta shrugged and sat down beside her on the ruined steps.
I think I'll sit with you a little while, if you'd like.
She nodded again and felt a little warmer for his words. And so they sat together on those steps outside the broken house of Okami and waited together, hoping that the darkness would be pushed back and light would return to their little corner of existence. And one day, it did. You've been listening to The House of Wolves by Mitchell Lüthi, performed by Anna Capraro and Scott Miller. Production copyright for Sentinel Creatives.